The dust hung thick in the air as Porter Jenkins slapped down $2 on the auction block. The coins making a pitiful sound against the weathered would all he had to his name after losing everything else. The crowd around him fell silent, then erupted in laughter as the auctioneer called out, "Sold! The mail-order bride no one else bid on goes to the fool with $2. Porter kept his eyes fixed on the young woman standing on the platform, her face downcast but her posture rigid with a dignity that surprised him. He didn't have much to offer her, but he reckoned a life with him had to be better than whatever else awaited her if he hadn't stepped forward. It was 1873 in the unforgiving territory of Montana, and the winter had been harsh on Porter's small cattle operation. At 32, he'd weathered enough seasons to know that without help, he wouldn't make it through another. The advertisement for mail-order brides had seemed like his last hope, though he hadn't planned on actually bidding today. He'd just come to town for supplies, but something about the dejected stance of the final woman presented had pulled at whatever decency remained in his heart. The woman Penelope Foster, according to her papers, kept her gaze lowered as Porter approached. She clutched a small valise that looked nearly as worn as the plain brown dress she wore. Her chestnut hair was tied back in a severe bun, but wisps escaped around her face, which was smudged with the grime of long travel. "Miss Foster," Porter said, tipping his hat. "I'm Porter Jenkins. I've got a small place about 10 miles from town. It ain't much, but it's shelter." She finally raised her eyes to his, and Porter was struck by their clarity, deep blue like the mountain lakes, and just as cold. "Mr. Jenkins, I appreciate your intervention. The other bids were less than favorable." Porter nodded, noticing for the first time that there were indeed other men hovering, rough-looking fellows who managed the saloon and brothel at the edge of town. His jaw tightened at the realization of what fate he'd spared her from, even if by accident. "Let's get your papers sorted and be on our way before sundown," he said, keeping his voice even. "Got supplies to pick up, and the trail gets treacherous in the dark." The transaction was completed with little ceremony. The marriage broker, a portly man with tobacco-stained fingers, handed over her contract with obvious disinterest. "She's supposed to fetch $50, he complained. "Boss'll have my hide." "She fetched what the market would bear," Porter replied flatly. $2 was the only bid you got that wasn't looking to put her to work on her back. The broker's face reddened. "Now see here, I saw plenty," Porter cut him off. "We're done." Outside, Porter loaded his meager supplies onto his wagon while Penelope stood quietly beside it, her valise clutched to her chest like a shield. "You can put that in the back," he offered, gesturing to her bag. She hesitated, then placed it carefully among his supplies. "Mr. Jenkins," she began, her voice steady despite her obvious discomfort, "I should inform you that I am not experienced in the ways of marriage, but I am a hard worker and I can cook and clean. I taught school back east before." She stopped abruptly. Porter paused in his loading. "Before what, Miss Foster?" She straightened her shoulders. "Before circumstances required me to seek other arrangements." He nodded, sensing there was much more to her story but respecting her right to keep it private. "I ain't looking for a wife in anything but name right now, Miss Foster. What I need is help with the ranch. It's just me since my brother passed last year and I'm falling behind. If you can cook and tend a garden, that'll be more than enough to start." Relief visibly washed over her features, though she maintained her composure. "I understand. Thank you for your candor." The ride to Porter's ranch was mostly silent, save for the creaking of the wagon and the occasional comment about the landscape. Porter pointed out landmarks to help Penelope orient herself: the tall pine that marked the turn off the main trail, the rock formation that resembled a sleeping bear, the creek that ran along the property line. As they crested the final hill, Porter's ranch came into view. It wasn't much a small cabin with a lean-to stable, a corral for the horses, and a barn that had seen better days. A few head of cattle grazed in the distance, far fewer than should have been there for a viable operation. "Home," Porter said simply, pulling the wagon to a stop. Penelope took in the scene with careful eyes. "How many cattle do you have?" 27, Porter answered, surprised by the question. "Lost nearly half the herd in the winter storms." She nodded thoughtfully. "And how many acres?" Porter eyed her with newfound curiosity. 160. "Homesteaded it 5 years ago with my brother. You know something about ranching, Miss Foster?" "My father had a small farm in Pennsylvania," she replied. "Nothing like this, but I understand the principles of animal husbandry and crop rotation." For the first time that day, Porter felt a glimmer of hope. Perhaps this arrangement wouldn't be as awkward as he'd feared. The cabin was sparse but clean. Porter had made an effort to tidy up whenever he went to town, never knowing when he might return with supplies or, apparently, a wife. There was one main room with a stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, and a small kitchen area. A door led to a single bedroom. "You'll take the bedroom," Porter said, setting down her valise. "I'll bunk out here by the fire." Penelope looked at him with surprise. "Mr. Jenkins, I cannot displace you from your own bed." "Porter," he corrected gently. "If we're to live together even just as partners in this venture, you might as well use my given name, and it's no trouble. Been falling asleep by the fire most nights anyway." She nodded slowly. "Then you must call me Penelope." She paused, looking around the cabin with a practical eye. "Is there water nearby?" "Well out back, and the creek's about 50 yards down the slope. Good fishing there too when there's time." "I'll prepare supper," she said, moving toward the small pantry. "You must be hungry after the journey." Porter watched her begin to examine his supplies with efficient movements. There was something about her that didn't fit the image of a desperate mail-order bride. Her speech was educated, her manner composed despite her circumstances. And those eyes, they held secrets and sorrows that made him wonder what had driven her to such a desperate measure, as offering herself as a bride to unknown men in the untamed West. As the sun set over the mountains, casting long shadows across the small ranch, Porter found himself with more questions than answers about Penelope Foster. But one thing was certain: for $2, he'd gotten far more than he'd bargained for. The first week of their arrangement passed in a careful dance of boundaries and adjustments. Penelope rose before dawn each morning, prepared a simple but hearty breakfast, and had Porter's lunch packed before he headed out to work with the cattle. She spent her days scrubbing the cabin to a shine it hadn't seen since it was built, mending clothes that Porter had thrown in a corner to deal with someday, and studying his small collection of books on animal husbandry and ranching. Porter returned each evening to find a hot meal waiting and a transformed living space. The cabin slowly took on a more hospitable feel, wildflowers in a tin can on the table, a quilt sheet unpacked from her valise spread over the back of his chair, the floors swept clean of the ever-present dust. On the 8th day, as Porter was saddling his horse, Penelope approached wearing a pair of men's trousers she'd altered and one of his old shirts with the sleeves rolled up. "I'd like to come with you today," she said without preamble. "To learn the operation." Porter paused, bridle in hand. "Miss Penelope, ranching isn't ladies' work." She raised an eyebrow. "Neither is starving because a ranch fails. You said yourself you're short-handed. I'm not afraid of hard work." He studied her for a moment, taking in the determined set of her jaw and the practical way she'd dressed. "Can you ride?" "Yes. Not Western style, but I can stay on a horse." Porter let out an older mare, gentle but still strong, This is Maple. She'll treat you fair if you do the same." By midday, Porter had to admit he was impressed. Penelope had a natural way with the animals and an eye for detail. She spotted a heifer hiding in the brush, clearly sick, that Porter might have missed until it was too late. "Bloat," she said confidently, examining the distended stomach of the animal. "My father's cattle would get it sometimes when they found the clover patch." Together, they managed to ease the heifer's discomfort. As they worked side by side, Porter found himself watching Penelope's hands, strong but feminine, moving with purpose and knowledge. There was something comforting about not being alone with the weight of the ranch anymore. That evening, as they sat at the table eating the stew Penelope had left simmering all day, Porter finally asked the question that had been nagging at him. "Why'd you come out here, Penelope? A woman with your education and skills could have found work back east." Penelope set down her spoon, her eyes fixed on some middle distance. For a moment, Porter thought she wouldn't answer. "I taught at a girls' school in Boston," she began quietly. "I was good at it. The headmistress was pleased with my work, the students respected me, and I had a small but comfortable life." She took a deep breath. "The headmaster's son took an interest in me. At first, I was flattered he came from wealth, had connections, seemed genuinely interested in my thoughts on education." Porter remained silent, sensing the turn in her story. "He asked me to marry him, and I accepted. 2 weeks before the wedding, I discovered he had made the same proposal to the daughter of a shipping magnate. When I confronted him, he laughed. Said a penniless teacher should be grateful for whatever attention a man of his standing would give her." Her hands tightened around her cup. "I broke the engagement publicly. He spread rumors that I had been improper with him. The school asked for my resignation. No other school would hire me. My reputation was ruined." Porter's jaw clenched at the injustice of it. "So you came west?" She nodded. "I saw an advertisement for mail-order brides. It seemed my only option, as I have no family left. I used the last of my savings for the train ticket." She finally looked up at him, a flash of vulnerability crossing her features. "I never expected to be auctioned off like cattle. When no one bid but those men from the saloon, I thought—" She stopped, unable to finish. "And then I showed up with my $2, Porter said softly. "Yes." A small smile touched her lips. "My knight in worn leather, bearing silver dollars instead of armor." Porter felt heat rise to his face. "Weren't nothing noble about it, just seemed wrong is all. Nevertheless, I am grateful." She hesitated. "Porter, I want you to know that I intend to earn my keep here. This arrangement may not be what either of us planned, but I believe we can make it work to both our advantages." He nodded, strangely moved by her determination. "I believe that too, Penelope." That night, as Porter settled into his bedroll by the fire, he found himself thinking of the strength it must have taken for Penelope to leave everything behind and travel across the country to an unknown fate. His admiration for her grew, along with something else he wasn't quite ready to name. As spring turned fully to summer, the rhythms of ranch life settled into a partnership neither Porter nor Penelope had anticipated. They worked the land together, mended fences side by side, and gradually, the small herd began to thrive under their combined care. Porter taught Penelope to ride Western style and to use a lasso. She surprised him by being a fair shot with a rifle, a skill her father had insisted every woman should have, just in case. In the evenings, they would sit on the small porch Porter had built onto the front of the cabin, watching the sunset paint the mountains in hues of gold and purple. Sometimes they talked, Porter telling stories of his younger days riding with cattle drives, Penelope sharing memories of her teaching days. Other times they sat in comfortable silence, the kind that only comes when two people have begun to understand each other beyond words. One evening in late July, as they sat shelling peas from Penelope's thriving garden, Porter noticed how the setting sun caught in her hair, which she had taken to wearing in a simple braid rather than the severe bun of their first meeting. She looked up, catching him watching her, and something passed between them, a current of awareness that had been building slowly over the weeks. Porter cleared his throat and looked away. "Town's having a social next Saturday. Thought you might like to go, meet some of the other women thereabouts." Penelope's hand stilled. "Are you sure? People might talk." "Let them talk," Porter said with more force than he intended. "You're my wife on paper. Ain't nothing improper about a man taking his wife to a social." She studied him for a moment, then nodded. "I would like that, thank you." The town social was held in the newly built schoolhouse, a point of pride for the growing community. Porter felt an unusual nervousness as he drove the wagon toward town, conscious of Penelope beside him in her best dress, a deep blue calico she'd carefully pressed for the occasion. He'd made an effort himself, shaving clean and wearing a shirt without a single patch. The schoolhouse was strung with paper lanterns, and a trio of musicians played lively tunes as couples danced and children ran about. Porter noticed several heads turn as he and Penelope entered, whispers following in their wake. "That's Jenkins, ain't it? With a woman. Heard he bought her for $2 when nobody else would bid. Mail-order bride, they say. Wonder what's wrong with her." Porter's jaw tightened, but Penelope laid a gentle hand on his arm. "It's all right," she murmured. "I expected as much." Before he could respond, they were approached by a woman with kind eyes and a practical manner. "You must be Mrs. Jenkins," she said warmly. "I'm Sarah Miller, the doctor's wife. We've been hoping you'd come to town. We have a ladies' aid society that meets every other Tuesday." Penelope's surprise was evident, but she recovered quickly. "Thank you, Mrs. Miller. I'm Penelope. It's a pleasure to meet you. Sarah, please. And this must be your husband. Dr. Miller mentioned treating your brother last year. I'm sorry for your loss." Porter nodded, touched by the simple acknowledgement. "Thank you, madam." More introductions followed, and Porter watched with a mixture of pride and something deeper as Penelope charmed the townspeople with her intelligence and grace. She was particularly drawn to the new schoolteacher, an earnest young woman overwhelmed by the prospect of teaching children of all ages in one room. "If you ever need assistance," Penelope offered, "I taught for several years back east." The young teacher's relief was palpable. "Would you consider coming in once a week? Even just to help with the older students' literature and mathematics would be a blessing." Penelope glanced at Porter, a question in her eyes. He nodded, understanding her need for something that was hers alone, something that connected her to the woman she had been before. "I'd be honored," she told the teacher. Later, as the musicians struck up a waltz, Porter surprised himself by holding out his hand to Penelope. "May I have this dance, Mrs. Jenkins?" Her eyes widened, but she placed her hand in his. "I didn't know you danced, Mr. Jenkins." "There's a lot we're still learning about each other," he replied, leading her to the makeshift dance floor. Porter wasn't a skilled dancer, but years of working with horses had given him a certain natural grace. Penelope followed his lead easily, and soon they were moving in harmony among the other couples. Porter was acutely aware of his hand at her waist, of the subtle scent of lavender that clung to her hair, of the way her eyes shone in the lantern light. As they danced, the whispers around them changed tone. "They move well together. She's brought that ranch back from the brink, from what I hear. $2. Seems Jenkins got himself a bargain after all." The ride home was quiet, but it was a different quality of silence than before, charged with unspoken thoughts and new awareness. When they reached the ranch, Porter helped Penelope down from the wagon, his hands lingering at her waist a moment longer than necessary. "Thank you," she said softly. "It was a lovely evening." "It was," he agreed, suddenly awkward. "You were a hit with the townspeople." She smiled. "They were very kind. It will be nice to help at the school." They stood for a moment in the moonlight, something hovering between them that neither was ready to acknowledge. Finally, Porter stepped back. "Better get some rest. Cattle won't wait come morning." As summer faded into fall, the ranch flourished under their combined efforts. The garden Penelope had planted yielded a bountiful harvest, which she preserved for the winter months ahead. Porter's herd, while still small, was healthier than it had been in years. Together, they repaired the barn roof and reinforced the corral, preparing for the harsh Montana winter to come. Penelope began riding into town once a week to assist at the school, returning with news and occasional small luxuries: a bit of ribbon, a book of poetry, coffee beans from the general store. She joined the Ladies' Aid Society, which met at Sarah Miller's home, and gradually found herself accepted into the community not as the woman Jenkins bought for $2, but as Penelope in her own right. Porter found himself watching the clock on the days she went to town, an unfamiliar restlessness overtaking him until he heard the sound of Maple's hooves announcing Penelope's return. The cabin felt empty without her presence, her humming as she worked, the scent of whatever she was cooking for their supper. One October afternoon, as Porter was mending a fence line, he spotted a rider approaching not from the direction of town, but from the north. He straightened, hand moving instinctively to the revolver at his hip. Visitors were rare, and not always welcome in these parts. As the rider drew closer, Porter recognized him as James Wilson, a rancher from 20 miles north with a reputation for hard deals and sharp practices. Porter had avoided doing business with him when possible, but as Wilson's ranch had prospered while others struggled, that was becoming increasingly difficult. "Jenkins," Wilson called as he reined his horse to a stop. "Been a while." Porter nodded coolly. "Wilson, what brings you this way?" Wilson dismounted, a tall man with a prosperous belly and cold eyes. "Heard you got yourself a wife. Mail order, they say." Porter's jaw tightened. "My personal business ain't yours to discuss." Wilson held up his hands in a placating gesture. "No offense meant, just making conversation." He glanced around the ranch, taking in the improvements. "Place is looking better than last time I passed by. Heard you lost half your herd last winter. We're managing." Wilson raised an eyebrow. "So the wife's more than just decoration then?" Porter took a step forward, anger rising. "State your business, Wilson. I've got work to do." Wilson's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Always direct, Jenkins. I like that about you. I'm here to make you an offer. I'm expanding my operation, looking to acquire more grazing land. Your property would connect nicely with my south pasture." "Not interested in selling." "I haven't named a price yet." "Don't matter what price. This land isn't for sale." Wilson studied him. "Times are hard, Jenkins. Winter's coming. A smart man knows when to cut his losses and move on. I'll give you a fair price enough to set yourself up somewhere else, maybe back east where your wife comes from." The thought of taking Penelope away from the home she'd helped build, the community she was becoming part of, made Porter's decision even easier. "Like I said, not interested." "Now if you'll excuse me." Wilson remounted his horse, his expression hardening. "Think about it, Jenkins. Offer won't stand forever. Man in your position should consider all his options." As Wilson rode away, Porter couldn't shake the feeling that the visit had been more than a simple business proposition. Something about Wilson's manner, the way his eyes had surveyed the property, the mention of Penelope left Porter uneasy. That evening, when Penelope returned from town, Porter told her about Wilson's visit. He has a reputation for getting what he wants, she said thoughtfully. Dr. Miller mentioned that the Abernathy family sold to him last spring after their well mysteriously went dry. Porter frowned. You think he'd sabotage our water? I think a man who wants your land badly enough might try many tactics. She hesitated. Porter, if you want to sell, I don't, he said firmly. This is our home. The word our hung between them, its significance not lost on either of them. Penelope's eyes softened as she reached across the table to touch his hand briefly. Then we'll defend it, she said simply. The first snow came early that year, blanketing the ranch in pristine white. Porter and Penelope had prepared well. The barn was stocked with hay, the root cellar full of preserved vegetables, the woodpile stacked high against the cabin wall. Still, the sudden onset of winter meant Porter spent long hours ensuring the cattle had access to feed and unfrozen water. He returned one evening to find Penelope at the table, an array of papers spread before her. She looked up as he stamped the snow from his boots. I've been going through the accounts, she said without preamble. Porter hung his coat by the door. Didn't know we had accounts to go through. Exactly the problem. She gestured to the papers. You've been tracking expenses haphazardly at best. I've organized everything from the past year as best I could from your notes. He approached the table, surprised by the neat columns of figures. You have a way with numbers. I taught mathematics, remember? She pointed to a final tally. If we sell the 10 steers you've been fattening at current market prices, we'll have enough to get through winter and purchase those breeding heifers you mentioned in the spring. Porter sat heavily in the chair across from her, a wave of gratitude washing over him. All his life, he'd struggled alone, first to prove himself to his father, then to make the ranch work with his brother, and finally to keep it going after Thomas died. Having someone beside him, someone who brought their own skills and perspective to the challenges they faced, was a gift he hadn't known to wish for. Thank you, he said simply. Penelope looked up, surprised by the emotion in his voice. It's just bookkeeping. It's more than that. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his own. It's you caring about this place, about, he hesitated, about our future here. Her eyes met his, a flush spreading across her cheeks. It is our future, isn't it? Not just an arrangement anymore. Porter held her gaze, something shifting between them. Hasn't been just an arrangement for some time now, Penelope. The confession hung in the air between them, neither quite ready to take the next step, but both acknowledging that something had changed, had been changing since that day he'd placed $2 silver on an auction block. The moment was broken by a sharp gust of wind that rattled the windows. Penelope withdrew her hand gently. The storm's picking up. You should get warm, I've made stew. That night, as the blizzard howled outside, Porter lay awake by the fire, thinking of Penelope just beyond the bedroom door. He'd come to care for her in a way he hadn't expected, not just as a partner in working the ranch, but as a woman whose strength and grace had awakened feelings he'd thought long buried. The question that kept him awake was whether she might feel the same. The winter stretched on, harsh and unforgiving. Porter and Penelope fell into new rhythms, confined more often to the cabin by snow and bitter cold. They spent evenings reading aloud from Penelope's small collection of books, playing checkers with a set Porter carved from scraps of wood, or simply talking. Porter found himself sharing stories he'd never told another soul about his difficult relationship with his father, his dreams for the ranch, his fears after Thomas died that he wouldn't be able to keep going alone. Penelope, in turn, spoke more of her life before her childhood on the Pennsylvania farm, her determination to get an education despite her father's initial reluctance, her joy in teaching young minds. She rarely mentioned the man who had betrayed her. But when she did, Porter noticed the hurt in her voice had lessened, replaced by a cool dismissal that spoke of healing. One particularly cold night in January, as they sat before the fire, Penelope darning socks while Porter cleaned his revolver, she asked a question that caught him off guard. "Have you ever been in love, Porter?" His hand stilled on the gun. "Once. Long time ago." She waited, her needle pausing in its rhythmic movement. "Her name was Elizabeth, daughter of a rancher near where I grew up in Texas. We were sweet on each other since we were 16. He set the revolver aside. "I asked her to marry me when I was 20. She said yes." Penelope's expression was gentle. "What happened?" "War happened. I joined up with the Confederacy not because I believed in the cause particularly, but because everyone was going. By the time I came back 3 years later, she'd married a banker from Austin." He shrugged, an old pain dulled by time. "Can't blame her, wasn't sure I'd come back at all." "I'm sorry," Penelope said softly, "was a lifetime ago." He looked at her, firelight playing across her features. "What about you? Was that man in Boston, was he your first love?" She shook her head, a sad smile touching her lips. "I thought he was at the time. But looking back, I was more in love with the idea of him, of stability, of belonging somewhere. I didn't really know him, not truly." She set her darning aside. "I've come to believe that real love must be built on knowing someone, seeing their flaws and strengths alike, and choosing them anyway." Porter felt a tightness in his chest at her words. "That's a wise way of looking at it." Their eyes met across the small space between them, and Porter wondered if she could hear the quickening of his heart. He wondered if she knew that he was coming to know her determination, her intelligence, her occasional stubbornness, her quiet strength, and that knowing her had only deepened his admiration. Before either could speak further, a noise from outside broke the moment, the distinctive sound of cattle in distress. Porter was on his feet instantly, reaching for his coat. "Stay here," he told Penelope as he grabbed his rifle. "Might be wolves." "I'm coming with you," she said firmly, already pulling on her own coat. "You shouldn't go alone." Outside, the bitter cold stole their breath as they made their way toward the cattle pen, lantern held high against the darkness. The herd was agitated, moving restlessly despite the late hour and cold. As they drew closer, Porter saw why the gate to the pen stood open, and several cattle had already wandered out into the deep snow. "Someone's opened the gate," Penelope said, her voice tight with anger. Porter nodded grimly. "Help me get them back in. If they scatter in this cold, we'll lose them for sure." For the next hour, they worked to herd the cattle back into the pen, struggling through snow drifts and against the animals' confusion. By the time they secured the gate with extra rope, both were exhausted and half frozen. Back in the cabin, as they huddled before the fire trying to warm numbed fingers and toes, Porter's mind worked furiously. "This was deliberate," he said. "Someone wanted our cattle to scatter and die in the cold." "Wilson," Penelope said, her expression hard. "He wants you desperate enough to sell." Porter nodded slowly. "Likely, but he won't succeed." He looked at her, at the determination in her eyes that matched his own. "We've worked too hard. We need to be more vigilant," she said. "Take turns keeping watch at night." "I'll do it. You need your rest." She shook her head firmly. "We're partners in this, Porter, equal partners. I'll take my turn." The pride he felt in that moment nearly overwhelmed him. Equal partners. Not just in working the ranch, but in facing whatever challenges came their way. He reached out, almost without thinking, and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering against her cheek. "Equal partners," he agreed softly. For a heartbeat, they remained frozen in that moment of contact, something electric passing between them. Then Penelope leaned into his touch, just slightly, her eyes never leaving his. Porter felt a surge of courage and leaned forward, closing the distance between them. Their lips met in a kiss that started tentative but quickly deepened as months of growing feelings found expression. When they finally pulled apart, both breathless, Porter rested his forehead against hers. "I've been wanting to do that for a while now," he admitted. "I've been hoping you would," she whispered back, a smile in her voice. That night, for the first time, Penelope didn't sleep in the bedroom alone. Porter held her close as the wind howled outside, marveling at how perfectly she fit against him, how right it felt to have her in his arms. They spoke in whispers of feelings long held back, of growing admiration turned to deeper emotion, of a partnership that had become so much more. In the weeks that followed, Porter and Penelope faced the winter's challenges together, not just as rancher and helper, not just as paper-married strangers, but as a couple united by genuine affection and shared purpose. They continued their vigilance, taking turns keeping watch for any further sabotage, but none came. Perhaps Wilson had decided his tactics wouldn't work, or perhaps the brutal weather made further mischief too difficult. As February gave way to March, and the first hints of spring began to appear in longer days and occasional thaws, Porter found himself making plans he hadn't dared consider before. The cattle had survived the winter better than expected, thanks to their careful management. The accounts Penelope kept showed they would indeed be able to expand the herd come spring. And most importantly, the future no longer seemed a lonely proposition of endless work with little reward. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the snow-covered landscape in pinks and golds, Porter took Penelope's hand in his. "I've been thinking," he began, suddenly nervous. "When I bid those $2 for you, I never expected us. I certainly never expected to fall in love." Penelope's eyes widened at the words he hadn't yet spoken aloud. "I love you, Penelope," he continued, his voice steadier now. "Not just for your help with the ranch, not just for your companionship, but for who you are. Your strength, your kindness, your determination. I know we're already married on paper, but I was wondering if you might consider making it real, not because of a contract or circumstances, but because we choose it, because we choose each other." Tears glistened in Penelope's eyes as she squeezed his hand. "I love you too, Porter. When I came west, I was running from a past I wanted to forget. I never expected to find a future I want to remember, to cherish." She smiled through her tears. "Yes, I choose you, I choose us." Porter pulled her into his arms, his heart fuller than he'd ever known it could be. The woman no one had wanted, the woman he'd claimed with his last $2, had become the greatest blessing of his life, the hope he hadn't known he needed, the partner he hadn't dared to wish for. Spring arrived in earnest, bringing with it new life and new beginnings. The meadows surrounding the ranch burst into wildflowers, the creek ran full with snowmelt, and the cattle grew fat on fresh grass. Porter and Penelope rode out together most days, working side by side to repair winter damage, check on the herd, and prepare for the calving season ahead. In town, they were no longer objects of curiosity and gossip, but accepted members of the community. Penelope continued her work at the school 1 day a week, her natural gift for teaching earning the respect of parents and children alike. Porter found himself included in discussions about cattle prices and range management, his quiet competence recognized by other ranchers. One Sunday in April, after the small church service, Reverend Thomas approached them with a smile. "Mrs. Jenkins, Mr. Jenkins, might I have a word?" They followed him to the church steps, exchanging curious glances. "I understand," the Reverend began, "that your marriage began as a matter of practicality. Such arrangements are common out here, of course." He cleared his throat. "But I've observed the two of you these past months, and it seems to me that what started as convenience has grown into something more genuine." Porter took Penelope's hand. "It has at that, Reverend." The older man beamed. "I thought as much. I wanted to offer my services, if you'd like to renew your vows this time before God and your community, as a true expression of your feelings for one another." Penelope's face lit up at the suggestion. "Porter, what do you think?" He squeezed her hand, moved by the idea of publicly declaring what had grown between them. "I'd be honored if you would." "Then it's settled," the Reverend said happily. "Next Sunday after service, the Ladies' Aid Society would be delighted to arrange a small celebration, I'm sure." As they rode home that afternoon, plans already forming for their renewal ceremony, Porter marveled at the journey that had brought them to this point. "Who would have thought," he said, "that the best investment of my life would be $2 at an auction block?" Penelope laughed, the sound carrying across the spring meadows. "I think I got the better deal myself." The following Sunday dawned clear and warm, as if nature itself approved of their celebration. The small church was decorated with spring wildflowers, and every member of the community turned out for the occasion. Sarah Miller had helped Penelope refashion her blue dress with new lace at the collar and cuffs, while Porter wore a new shirt purchased specially for the day. As they stood before Reverend Thomas, hands joined and hearts full, Porter barely heard the words of the ceremony, so focused was he on the woman before him, no longer the desperate, dignified stranger from the auction block, but his partner, his friend, his love. When it came time to speak their vows, Porter's voice rang clear and true. "Penelope, when I found you, I was a man with nothing but a struggling ranch and $2 to my name. Now I'm the richest man in Montana, because I have your love. I promise to cherish you, to stand beside you through whatever life brings, to be your equal partner in all things, for all the days we're given." Tears shone in Penelope's eyes as she responded, "Porter, you saw value in me when no one else did. You gave me not just a home, but purpose and respect, and in time, love. I promise to face life's challenges with you, to share its joys, to build our dreams together, for as long as we both shall live." When Reverend Thomas pronounced them husband and wife truly, this time, in heart as well as law, the small church erupted in cheers. The celebration that followed at the schoolhouse was modest by some standards, but felt like a feast to Porter and Penelope. The community that had once whispered about them now toasted their happiness, the women hugging Penelope with genuine affection, the men clapping Porter on the back with approval. As the afternoon waned, Porter noticed James Wilson standing at the edge of the gathering, watching with an unreadable expression. When their eyes met, Wilson gave a slight nod before turning to leave. Porter understood it as acknowledgement, perhaps even respect, and a sign that the threat had passed. Their determination had won out against his tactics. That evening, as they returned to their ranch, their home, Porter helped Penelope down from the wagon and then surprised her by sweeping her into his arms. "Porter," she laughed as he carried her toward the cabin, "what are you doing?" "Carrying my bride across the threshold," he replied with a grin. "Properly this time." Inside, the cabin no longer felt like the bachelor quarters it had once been. Under Penelope's care, it had become a true home, still simple, still reflective of the hard work of ranching life, but warm with touches that spoke of permanence and belonging. A quilt on their bed made from scraps of meaningful fabrics. Books lining shelves Porter had built. Wildflowers in a jar on the table, changed with the seasons. Small things that together created a haven. As spring gave way to summer, and summer to fall, the ranch prospered under their joint stewardship. The herd grew, The garden flourished, and with careful management of the resources Penelope tracked so meticulously, they were able to hire occasional help for the busiest seasons. The lean-to stable was replaced with a proper structure, and they added a small room onto the cabin planning. Porter admitted with a mix of hope and shyness, for the family they might one day have. That hope was realized the following spring, when Penelope shared the news that she was expecting. Porter's joy knew no bounds as he gently placed a hand on her still flat stomach, imagining the child that would join their family come winter. "Boy or girl, doesn't matter to me," he told her as they lay together one evening, his hand protectively covering where their child grew. "Long as they have your brains and determination." Penelope smiled, running her fingers through his hair. "And your heart, Porter Jenkins. Your generous, seeing heart that looked past what everyone else saw and found something worth $2 silver. Best bargain of my life," he murmured against her lips. "And I'd pay it 1,000 times over." Their daughter, Hope Elizabeth Jenkins, was born on a snowy December night, with Sarah Miller attending the birth while Porter paced anxiously outside the bedroom door. When he was finally allowed in, the sight of Penelope holding their tiny daughter, exhausted but radiant, brought him to his knees beside the bed. "She's perfect," he whispered, touching a gentle finger to his daughter's downy head. "Just like her mother." As Hope grew from infant to toddler, the ranch continued to thrive. Porter and Penelope worked as they always had, side by side when possible, dividing tasks when necessary, each contributing their strengths to their shared enterprise. The mail-order bride no one had wanted, and the struggling cowboy with just $2 to his name had built a life that was rich in all the ways that truly mattered. 3 years after Hope's birth, they welcomed a son, Thomas Porter Jenkins, named for the brother Porter had lost and the father who had found his future in an unexpected place. Their family was complete, their home filled with the laughter and energy of children growing up in the freedom of the Montana countryside. On the 10th anniversary of the day Porter had placed those $2 on the auction block, he presented Penelope with a small velvet box after the children were asleep. "What's this?" she asked, surprised by the unexpected gift. "Open it," he urged. Inside lay a delicate gold locket. When Penelope opened it, she found something unexpected: $2 polished to a high shine, set into either side of the locket. "I've kept them all these years," Porter explained softly. "A reminder of how the smallest actions can change the course of a life. Of how the best things come from the most unlikely beginnings." Tears filled Penelope's eyes as she closed the locket and let Porter fasten it around her neck. "Our beginning," she said, touching the pendant where it rested against her heart. "And our middle," he agreed, taking her in his arms. "But nowhere near our end." As they stood together in the home they had built, surrounded by the life they had created together, Porter knew with absolute certainty that those $2, all he'd had to his name on that dusty day a decade ago, had purchased not just a wife, not just help with a struggling ranch, but his very future. His hope, his happiness. And in a world as uncertain as the wild Montana territory, that was a bargain beyond price. Penelope Jenkins, once the mail-order bride no one wanted, had become the heart of a thriving ranch, the beloved teacher who rode into town each week to share her knowledge with the community's children, the mother who read stories by lamplight and taught her daughter and son both practical skills and book learning. And most of all, she had become the partner and love of a man who had once been alone, struggling against odds that seemed insurmountable. Together, they had built something that would last: not just a ranch, not just a family, but a legacy of love that had begun with $2 silver and the courage to see value where others saw none.